We are now taking a trip across the pond where we basically have found the Dirty Dick Danny of the UK. So this man's name is David Carrick, and he was given life in prison with the minimum of 30 years. And I'm trying to figure out how in the world does that work? How do you get a life sentence with a minimum of 30 years? Listen, Operation Protect the White Boy doesn't just work here in the States. Apparently works in other places as well. Now, the reason why I gave him the role or the title of the Dirty Dick Danny of the UK is because, like Dirty Dick Danny here, or Daniel Holtzclaw, as many know him, who committed violations against numerous black women and went to prison for it, and ironically got sentenced on his birthday to like 240 years. This guy is no different. The only difference is I don't think that these were all black women that he did this to, considering this is the UK we're talking about. Not saying that they don't have a black population over there, but it's most likely a lot of PC women. Well, this guy committed deviant acts on at least or about more than 70 sex attacks on at least a dozen women, at least, which means it's no less than 12, which is right around the ballpark range of Daniel Holtzclaw. But 70, which means these were some repeats that he did to some of the same women. He just went back and rotated like it was a Rolodex. Let's see what they're talking about. David Carrick, the Metropolitan Police Officer and serial violator, will serve at least 30 years behind bars for carrying out more than 70 sex attacks on at least a dozen women. I'm trying to figure out where does the life part come in, because I'm seeing at least 30 and he should get way more than 30. In a 2-day sentencing hearing, Southwark Crown Court heard how the 48-year-old monster used his power and control to carry out a catalog of violent and brutal sex attacks between 2003 and 2020. This guy was going on a rampage for almost 2 decades. And they just got him. That's crazy. His victim spoke on how they had encountered evil, and the court was told Carrick sent one of his victims a photograph of himself with a work issue gun saying, "Remember, I am the boss." Carrick, who was sacked from the force following his conviction, was handed 36 life sentences with a minimum term of 32 years. The sex predator previously admitted 49 charges, including 24 counts of violations and charges of sexual assault, controlling and coercive behavior, and false imprisonment. Deducting the number of days he had spent in custody from his minimum term on Tuesday, Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb told the defendant, "These convictions represent a spectacular downfall for a man charged with upholding the law and empowered to do so, even to the extent of being authorized to bear a firearm in the execution of his duty." Carrick sat in the dock wearing a dark suit, white shirt, and pattern tie as Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb began her sentencing remarks. The judge said she had considered the possibility of imposing a whole life tariff, but had decided that his offenses did not meet the quote-unquote wholly exceptional test, whatever the hell that is. She said he had taken monstrous advantage of his position as a police officer to brazenly violate and sexually assault many women. "You believe you were untouchable, and for many years you were," she told him. The judge said that some of Carrick's victims had been forced into controlling and coercive relationships, and she said he had demonstrated an escalating extreme domination of these women. She said he had also shown his utter contempt for his victims as human beings. The court was told that one of Carrick's victims had mild learning disabilities and their relationship had been exploitive. The judge said he had initially been charming towards her, but under the influence of alcohol turned into a monster, violating, abusing, and humiliating her. Mrs. Justice Chima Grubb said Carrick's crimes had an irretrievably devastating impact on the lives of his victims. "You have shaped their lives and deprived them of the ability to form relationships," she said. The judge noted that Carrick's violent sexual offending commenced almost immediately after he became a police constable. She told Carrick, "You have lost your liberty, job, and status, and the prospect of a difficult time in custody for many years." As the court was taking through the details of each harrowing offense, Carrick sat in the glass-walled dock with his head bowed, flanked by 2 male custody officers. The judge told the court that during a pre-sentence report, Carrick had claimed he had suffered childhood trauma at the hands of alcoholic parents and an abusive stepfather. Here they go. They have to throw that in there for the reasons to why they did what they did. So you mean to tell me you couldn't get any type of help? If that is what you're saying is true. It's amazing they bring that up after the fact. And then a lot of times there's no proof to back up if what they're saying is true or not. The judge also revealed that while on remand at H&P Belmarsh, Carrick had tried to kill himself. He was airlifted to hospital where he recovered and was returned to custody. Mrs. Chima Grubb said in her opinion, the suicide attempt had been a self-pitying action brought on by the shame of these proceedings rather than remorse. The court was also told Carrick had been treated at the Secure Hospital at Rampton, where he had been diagnosed with severe depression. Alice Dare Williamson, Carrick's lawyer, said that the defendant did not ask for mercy and did not expect any. He said there can be no excuse, only the shadow of an explanation. He is a testament of the abused becoming the abuser. Last month, Carrick, who was an armed officer with the Met's Parliamentary and Diplomatic Protection Unit, pled guilty to 49 separate charges, confirming his status as one of Britain's most prolific sex offenders. On Monday, the court heard heart-rending accounts from his victims, who described how his years of abuse and destroyed their lives and shattered their confidence in the police. Carrick was arrested in October 2021 after a woman came forward to Hertfordshire Constabulary to report that she had been violated by a serving Met officer. Following the publicity surrounding his arrest and charge, more women came forward with allegations of sexual abuse, violations, and domestic violence dating back to 2003. 2 of his victims were police officers, while others were targeted because they were vulnerable. It subsequently emerged that police missed no fewer than 9 opportunities to identify Carrick's patterns of behavior in offending, which lasted almost 2 decades. Southwark Crown Court heard how Carrick repeatedly used his status as a police officer to attract, abuse, and then silence his victims, convincing them that they would never be believed if they came forward. One victim described how she was too frightened to report him after he drilled into her that he was the police and he was the law. Another, who suffered a violent violation at his hands, recalled how she was told by a nurse in the hospital that there was little point in lodging a complaint because the law protects its own. Outlining the prosecution case against him, Tom Little told Southwark Crown Court that Carrick had been responsible for a systematic catalog of violent and brutal sexual offenses perpetrated on multiple victims. The prosecutor said it did not matter to Carrick who the victims were, adding, where he had the opportunity, he would violate them, sexually abuse them, assault them, and humiliate them. He frequently relied on his charm to beguile and mislead the victims in the first place, and then he would use his power and control, in part because of what he did for a living, to stop them from leaving or consider reporting him. He was no doubt aware that they would conclude that they would be unlikely to be believed if they were to come forward on their own and claim that a metropolitan police officer had violated them. Carrick targeted his first victim in 2003, meeting her at a bar and telling her she would be safe with him because he was a police officer. He then invited the woman back to his South London flat, where he repeatedly and violently violated her. The court was told that as she tried to get away, she had bitten his arm, and Carrick had put a black handgun to her head, telling her, "You're not going." In her moving impact statement, the woman said, "That night, I felt I had encountered evil. For the past 19 years, I've been lost in my own life, mainly due to this one event. I distinctly remember his words. 'Come on, you can trust me. I am the safest person you can be around. I am a police officer.'" So let me stop right there before I go any further. This literally parallels just like Dirty Dick Danny, because I bet you he did the same exact thing to his victims. This guy used his status as a police officer to basically coerce these women to stay with him, almost like a brainwashing tactic. And then that's when he went in for the attack. And it worked clearly for almost 2 decades. That's the scary part, is that he got away with it for so long. I honestly thought he was going to kill me that night. I thought he was going to violate me and kill me and that my life would be over. Another one of Carrick's victims, who was subjected to almost 2 years of degrading sexual attacks, described how he threatened her with his police baton and sent her a photograph of his work issue firearm saying, "Remember, I am the boss." Carrick would sometimes use dating websites to target his victims, often entering into controlling and coercive relationships. One victim described how he dictated what she could eat and when she could sleep, locking her in a tiny cupboard under the stairs if she displeased him. The Met failed to take action against Carrick despite numerous complaints being raised about his behavior. He was finally sacked from the force last month after pleading guilty and being unmasked as one of the country's most prolific sex offenders. So keep this in mind. This story just came out this month. He was just let go from his position last month. I just want y'all to keep that in mind. Carrick's crimes are set to form part of the independent inquiry looking at the 2021 murder of Sarah Everard, who was violated and strangled by Wayne Couzens at the time of serving Met police officer. Whew, that was a lot. I didn't expect them to go into that much detail, but I'm glad they did so we can get a little bit of a backstory about who this piece of shit is on your screen. But when I'm reading that, the way that they gave protection and cover to this guy is no different than what they do for a lot of the cops over here. So reading this, I can see the similarities between their policing and our policing over here. It's a lot of similarities there. It's some differences, but with this right here, what they did with him and how they handled or not handled the situation over there with him, I guarantee they would do some of the same stuff over here. To what extent, I'm not entirely sure. But again, remember, Dirty Dick Danny, he was getting away with it for a little bit. Not as long as he was, but he was getting away with it before they finally got him. But he has to have the entire bookshelf thrown to his ass. 30 years is not nearly enough for what he did for over almost 20 years. That's where the Operation Protect the White Boy comes into play. 30 years minimum? Nah, he needs to spend the rest of his life behind bars. I don't know what the London or the UK or wherever this is prison system is like, but I do know one thing for sure. If their system is, or their prison system is anything like it is over here where the inmates aren't really too friendly to cops, he's going to have a rough time behind bars. He may not even make it to the 30-year minimum. And you know what? I hope he doesn't.